Welcome to the WRAL Daily Download. I'm Jack Hagel. All eyes were on North Carolina at the U.S. Supreme Court yesterday. Justices heard arguments in Moore v. Harper. It's a case that emerged from the state's most recent redrawing of voting districts. It's focused on who has the ultimate power to determine election rules, the state legislature or state courts. We've been focused on the case all week at the Daily Download, with episodes featuring all sides of the argument and analysis from our reporters and other political experts. So be sure to check those out in the WRAL Daily Download feed. Today, we're going to start with WRAL state government reporter Travis Fain. He wrote about the case yesterday on WRAL.com. Later in the episode, we'll hear from WRAL Capitol Bureau Chief Laura Leslie. She was in Washington yesterday, and we caught up with her after the arguments for an on-the-ground report. Travis, before we get into the weeds, for the listeners who maybe haven't listened to the other episodes in this series, give us a very quick summary of what this case is about.
All right. It's like you said, it's who has the power over election law, although it's just federal elections. We're only talking about federal elections. And the reason we're only talking about federal elections is there's a line in the United States Constitution in Article 1. It says that the time, places, and manners of federal elections, congressional elections, will be set by state legislatures or Congress. And so for years and years and years, centuries, that has meant, all right, state legislatures set these rules for, when the election is and what rules it will be operated under, including redistricting, congressional redistricting, what the maps look like. But state Supreme Courts have stepped in here and there and said, you violated actually the state constitution on this rule or that rule, you got to change it. North Carolina Republicans got tired of that because of a redistricting case over the last year or so, said that our state Supreme Court, the North Carolina State Supreme Court, had overstepped its bounds. And so they're pointing to this part of the Constitution and saying, look, you guys are not empowered to tell us what to do when it comes to federal elections because the United States Constitution is the number one rule. It's above all these other laws. It's above the state Supreme Court, and it says state legislature. It doesn't say state legislature with the court coming in and granting oversight. So that's what the case is about. Does that theory hold water? And if so, how far does it go?
Now, Republicans say that this is just a very narrow case, whereas opponents to the Republicans who brought this to the Supreme Court, they say it's much broader and it will have ramifications on a wide variety of things involving elections. Based on what you heard, and you listened to the arguments yesterday, based on what you heard, what did you take away?
I think, like a lot of cases, it will be as broad or as narrow as the justices deciding the case make it. There are ways to write a ruling here where you disagree with the Republicans. There are ways to write a ruling where you agree with them, but you don't take it as far as you could. You could make it fairly specific to North Carolina. Our state constitution, which was relied on to throw out the congressional districts here by our state Supreme Court, has vaguer language on these points than do state constitutions in other states. So, that could be a dividing line. There was a good bit of back and forth about how vague or specific a constitution could be. But look, this is a broad argument that Republicans are making here. Their argument boils down to state courts can make no substantive changes to federal election laws. It is the state legislature's purview, and that the U.S. Constitution makes that clear.
All right, let's focus on some of the highlights of the arguments yesterday. Give me a few of the most telling things that you heard.
So I don't know if this is one of the most telling, but I found it one of the more interesting things is some of the liberal justices were questioning the attorney for Republicans here and saying, all right, you're saying state constitutions and state courts have no role to play here. What about gubernatorial vetoes? Can a governor veto a law that a state legislature passes that has to do with the manner and place of elections? And he said, yes. And they said, well, doesn't your argument fall apart then? Like, how can you have one thing and not the other? And he basically was arguing that when a governor vetoes a law, that's a procedural change. That is, as he put it, a hoop the legislature has to jump through in order to pass a law in their state. Whereas the state court, in this case, at least here in North Carolina, was making a substantive change to the procedure, to the law. And there was enough back and forth on that where I wondered, all right, is this somewhere, there's friction here. Is this going to be some of the friction that ends up deciding this case?
So I'm going to put you on the spot here, and I know you're not a fortune teller, and make an educated guess. What does your gut say about how the court might rule based on what you heard?
I hesitate to give any sort of prediction. I mean, obviously, there were 4 conservative judges. So it's a 9-member court, 6-3 conservative versus liberal. So, I mean, the conservatives have the advantage here. Republicans have the advantage here. 4 of those conservative justices actually suggested that Republicans in North Carolina bring this case before them because, I mean, it has a history, right? It's been going on for more than a year. And at some point, the Republicans tried to go up to the Supreme Court earlier, and they were told, no, not right now. But, these 4 justices suggested, hey, maybe come back later, and they did, and the case was accepted. So you're kind of already starting there with an advantage if you're the Republicans. But I just don't know how far they're going to be willing to go. And it seemed to me like some of the justices were searching for a way to come up with a narrow ruling, but that doesn't mean they will. It is so difficult. These things are so complicated, and then you have to get into 9 different heads. So people will make their predictions, and a lot of them will end up being right because people pay a lot of attention to the United States Supreme Court. But I would caution anybody. They're going to tell us in a few months anyway. Just wait.
Is there any justice in particular who stood out to you?
They all stand out in their own way, but I'll mention the newest justice, Ketanji Brown Jackson. She really pressed the attorney for state lawmakers here and basically saying, look, a state legislature is a creature of its state constitution. So how can you say that the courts cannot use the state constitution to interpret whether or not the state legislature created by that state constitution has done what they are allowed to do within the construct of that state constitution? So I thought that was a really interesting argument. And of course, the way out of it may end up being, well, state constitutions do have some control, but it's this difference between a substantive change versus a procedural one, and how specific constitutional language, state constitutional language is when it comes to laying out what you can and cannot do in redistricting, what you can and cannot do with other election laws.
Travis, thanks for breaking it down for us.
All right. Thanks for having me.
That's WRAL state government reporter Travis Fain. To read his coverage of Moore v. Harper, visit the NC Capital section of WRAL.com. We're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll hear from WRAL Capitol Bureau Chief Laura Leslie. She's reporting from Washington, where she watched the arguments. Stick around. Welcome back to the WRAL Daily Download. We're talking about the Moore v. Harper case that was before the U.S. Supreme Court yesterday. It's a case born out of a North Carolina elections lawsuit. In this segment, we're joined by WRAL Capitol Bureau Chief Laura Leslie. She joined us yesterday by phone from Washington, where she was reporting on the arguments. She spoke with us as she was getting ready to go on air. Paint a picture of your day. Put us in the room.
Well, let's see. We got up really, really early because we needed to trek over to NBC News, where they were kind enough to give us some workspace. Because there's no workspace outside the Supreme Court. All there is a sidewalk. There's nowhere to sit. There's no power. There's no bathroom. There's no nothing. So we came over here first, and we headed over to the Supreme Court and stood in line to get into the press section, of course. They put you through, lots and lots of security checks, and they have to usher you into the chamber. And you're just hoping that you get the seat that doesn't have the blocked view so you can see. And I got really lucky. I got to see the whole thing. So that was great. And then you just have to sit there. And we were expecting the arguments to go for maybe 90 minutes. They went for nearly 3 hours. Now, I don't know if that's a record, but it's certainly unusual. And the room was pretty much full of a lot of lawyers and a lot of North Carolina politicians and elected officials. It was interesting to see Representative Deborah Ross, a Democrat, sitting next to Representative Virginia Foxx, a Republican. We also had Josh Stein sitting behind them, and we had House Speaker Tim Moore sitting sort of in the center section. So we were kind of keeping watch on how they were reacting to all this, even as we're watching how the judges are reacting to the arguments up front. And, the arguments themselves were very fast moving and very extensive, really wide ranging, everything from the 1600s up through, this current decade. And lots of skepticism, I think, on both sides in this case, about, the independent state legislature theory, which, I think there was a lot of skepticism, even from some of the conservative judges, about some of the arguments that North Carolina's Republican lawmakers were making. But on the other side, there was a lot of skepticism especially about the ruling that the state Supreme Court made in this case, saying that redistricting, political gerrymandering redistricting is unconstitutional under the state constitution. And, I think we saw some pretty strong signals that there are at least some members of the court who would be open to sort of going in and overturning that ruling. And we heard, some of the attorneys for the respondents in this case, which is your voting rights groups and the state, saying that the U.S. Supreme Court has never gone in and said that a state Supreme Court's interpretation of its own constitution was wrong. Now, I can't independently verify that, but I didn't hear anybody come back with an answer. So it sounds like it would be at least extremely rare. So
you mentioned in a previous episode that you were going to be paying particular attention to Justice Kavanaugh.
Right.
What did you hear from him?
He was by turns skeptical and slightly sympathetic toward the argument from state lawmakers. It was made by David Thompson. He was their lead attorney. He definitely had a lot of kind of sharp questions for him, but he was also kind of trying to walk through sort of the historical argument that Thompson was making in support of this independent state legislature theory. He had some questions, although not quite as many, I don't think, for the attorney for the respondents. That's Neil Katyal, who was the lead attorney. And then there were two other attorneys who represented the state and the US DOJ. So he had, some questions, but not quite as fiery as, for example, Neil Gorsuch. Justice Gorsuch was clearly not having much of this of this argument from the respondents. He was pretty feisty in his questioning of Neil Katyal. We didn't see quite so much fire coming from Kavanaugh. So, I think that kind of fits with what I was kind of expecting, which is I think he's open to seeing this, but he wants to get this case this issue really fully expounded and before the court and settled.
Now, you've told us what happened inside the courtroom. What did things look like outside? Did you talk to anybody who was there from North Carolina?
Well, there were people there from North Carolina. I was stuck in the courtroom for the duration, but there was a rally this morning, I understand. And then after the hearing, Speaker Moore came right out and talked at the podium, and also Josh Stein came out, Attorney General Josh Stein. And then the folks with the voting rights groups held a press conference up kind of on the plaza right outside, right next to the steps. So, yeah, there were plenty of folks from North Carolina weighing in afterward.
And what did Stein and Moore have to say?
Well, of course, everybody thinks that everything went well for them. Don't they always, right?
Right.
They always do. They're never going to say that. Moore said that he was glad that they had heard the case. He thinks that things that some of the justices said really sort of mirrored some of their concerns that the lawmakers had about this. In the meantime, Neil Katyal said that he felt that that the justices had asked a lot of the questions he was hoping that they would ask. He felt like things went pretty well for them too. Of course, nobody on either side was about to predict any outcome in this case.
So after 3 hours of arguments and then hearing what Moore and Josh Stein have to say, what does your gut tell you? What do you think will happen out of this? Is there any way to tell?
I don't think I can say that. Let's put it this way. If the experts can't say, I don't think I can either.
All right. Fair enough. Is there anything else that surprised you?
It was kind of interesting to see the court. I was kind of surprised by how long it went, because I'd always been told that they did try to limit their arguments, but they clearly had a lot of questions and they definitely wanted to get them answered. And this is their chance to do that.
Well, Laura, thanks for being our eyes and ears there.
Thank you.
That's WRAL Capitol Bureau Chief Laura Leslie. For her coverage of Moore v. Harper from Washington, visit nccapital.com. And be sure to check out our other episodes in this series. You can find them in the WRAL Daily Download feed. And thanks for listening to the WRAL Daily Download and for making us part of your morning routine. Another great way to get WRAL news is the Morning Briefing newsletter. It's a daily email with Triangle news, events, and headlines to help you get ready for the day. Sign up at WRAL.com/newsletter.